guest for today. Cheryl Fogo is a multiple award-winning playwright, author, and filmmaker whose work over the last 30 years has focused on the lives of Western Canadians of African descent. Recent works include the release of her NFB feature documentary, John Ware Reclaimed, which is available on nfb.ca, as well as the 30th anniversary edition of her book, Pouring Down Rain. A Black woman claims her place in the Canadian West. She has multiple projects coming up in 2022, including a production of her play, Heaven, at Lunchbox Theatre in Calgary, and a production of her play, John Ware Reclaimed, at the Blyth Festival. Cheryl is the recipient of the Lieutenant Governor of Alberta Outstanding Artist Award, the Doug and Lois Mitchell Outstanding Calgary Artist Award, and the Arts, Media, and Entertainment Award from the Calgary Black Chambers, all in 2021. Bertrand Bickersteth is a poet, playwright, and essayist, an educator who was born in Sierra Leone and raised in Alberta. His collection of poetry, The Responsive Weeds, was a finalist for multiple awards and won the League of Canadian Poets Gerald Lampert Memorial Award, the Writers Guild of Alberta Stefan G. Stephenson Award for Poetry, and the 2021 High Plains Book Award in the category of First Book. His writing has appeared in many places, including Geist, the Malahat Review, The Walrus, The Sprawl, and the CBC project Black on the Prairies. He is a forthcoming essay in Prairie Fire and is currently working on a collection of poems highlighting the history of Black Cowboys in Western Canada. He lives in Calgary, teaches at Olds College, and writes about Black identity on the prairies. So please welcome to the stage, Cheryl and Bertrand. Hi, Cheryl. Hi, Bertrand.
Hi, Candy.
Hi, Candy.
Thanks very much for that introduction.
Hi, Bertrand.
Hi, Cheryl. Great to see you again.
You too. You too.
That was a lovely introduction, and always a great reminder for me to hear all the amazing things that you have done and are always involved in. I don't know if folks in BC are aware of this, but me as a writer, I couldn't exist without Cheryl, because Cheryl is really the gatekeeper for Black history in Alberta and the prairies that helped to make people like me feel like being a writer is actually possible. So super important in very, very many ways. Absolutely.
Aww,
yeah, and it's my honor to be able to sit here and chat with you.
Well, there's no one I would rather be chatting with tonight.
And you don't even have to answer all that gushing praise, okay? That's just straight from the heart to you. All right, so I wanted to very quickly acknowledge, because we are both in Calgary, that we are in Treaty 7 territory here. Although you folks are somewhere else, well, I guess we have people all over the place, but the hosts are in Vancouver. And this is the home of Blackfoot Confederacy, which consists of Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani. Also the Stoney Nakoda people, Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Morley. And finally, it's Tsuut'ina. But it's also home to Métis Region 3 as well, and has been a home to several different Indigenous peoples who have crossed throughout our history, I want to say, but that's a loaded term. I wanted to give that acknowledgement, not only because it's important, but because as Black people who have been historically connected to the settlers who came and displaced Indigenous people, I think that we hold a very special relationship to Indigenous peoples, and that it's not always an easy alignment, Indigenous versus settler versus Black, but it's important because we've shared certain things with Indigenous people. We have things that are distinct, but we have a significant relationship. And so I wanted to acknowledge that. All right, having done that now, thank you, VPL, for inviting me to do this. Really appreciate it. Thank you to both Candy and Andrew for helping guide us through this. Let's get started, folks, okay? So my favorite conversation always has to do with Black history and the prairies. And my favorite person to talk about that is Cheryl. We're going to be talking about cowboys and Black cowboys and that rich tradition that is very often associated with Alberta, particularly Southern Alberta. I always avoided cowboy imagery when I was young. I always felt a little bit weird by it. You know, I remember being about 12 years old and having to go to the Stampede. And those of you who are not familiar with the Stampede, you should be, but you know, you Vancouverites who have your cute little PNE It's a little bit different, okay? It's something like that, but it also has the madcap rodeo added to it. And if you don't have rodeo madness, you don't really have a major summer festival. Okay, not to get competitive or anything like that. But I do remember this one year, I was 12 years old, I had to go to the Stampede. And I say had to because when you're that age, you know, you're a little bit self-conscious about things. And my parents were all decked out in their cowboy this and their cowboy that. And I was starting to feel like, do I want to look like this? I don't know. I don't know if I want to be associated with cowboys. Because for me, all my life, I had been shown that cowboys was a world that did not belong to me. It was a world for other people who had more legitimacy being cowboys and therefore more legitimacy being here and belonging to here. Finally, when I was introduced to John Ware as an adult, I realized that, there were Black cowboys and I can connect with that. And I do feel connected with it. But I've had to overcome that childhood experience. I'm curious how that was for you, Cheryl. I mean, now you've written on John Ware and you've had this amazing documentary about him. But what was your relationship to cowboys as a young child when you were growing up?
As a very young child, I saw Black men specifically wearing cowboy hats, jeans, and cowboy boots frequently. Many of the elders in my community were farming and ranching people themselves, and that was natural garb for them. So it was not an unusual sight. I grew up in Calgary, as did you, and you're a little bit younger than me. Well, quite a bit younger than me, Bertrand. But back in my day, I'll tell you, there was nothing else. It was a stampede. That was it. And so, yes, you were, if you were a Calgarian, that was a world that you had to participate in. So it felt natural for me to go to the Stampede, to wear my cowboy hat and my little, my little fringed vest and my little cowboy boots, along with my siblings. My brother Richard and I played cowboys all the time, as I reiterated in my film. But as I got older as well, I went through a similar experience to you, because I did not see us in the films that I watched or the TV shows, or there was no representation of us in the Roy Rogers books that I read. I also began to feel like I was not welcome in that world, or it was not a world for me, even though I had evidence in the elders in my community who I saw that were living embodiments of that world in a way. I also moved away from it and felt strange about it, and in some ways rejected that aspect of myself that had been very important to me as a youngster. So it was John Ware also rescued me out of that place of feeling divided within myself, feeling like this was a part of me, and yet it wasn't a part of me that I wasn't allowed to embrace. Similar.
Well, sorry to interrupt you. I found it very interesting when you were talking about growing up with examples of Black people wearing cowboy hats and being connected to ranching and that sort of thing. And it's true, I didn't have that experience. And so I wasn't able to connect with that. But I've always thought to myself, if I had grown up like Cheryl, and if I'd seen those things, maybe I wouldn't have had to struggle in the way that I did. But it sounds like that even you went through a period as well in which you kind of struggled with and against those images too. Am I right?
Absolutely. And I think that is because media and popular culture are how we shape our notion of what the world is like in many ways. And if I was going by what I saw reflected in films, television, literature, what the world was like was that cowboys were white, not Black.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the environment that you grew up in and the Black communities that you were connected to. Because you've often talked about John Ware as belonging to a kind of Black community that was even before yours. And for folks who are not very familiar with this history, you should know that Cheryl is descended from original Black pioneers in on the prairies. So these are people who are original homesteaders at the very beginning of the 20th century who moved from the American South by and large and set up in the prairies as farmers and homesteaders, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't want to tell your whole story for you. I should let you do this. But Cheryl, I know that like me, you were under the impression that you came from the first community of Black people in Alberta. And I just want to quickly say, that's what I used to think too, okay? And I was a kid in the 1970s. And I used to think that my little group of African immigrants, that we must have been the first. But clearly we were not. And when I learned about your history and your family history, it was so invigorating and rooting for me. But then it turns out that even you had an experience similar to mine in which you discovered that actually your community wasn't even the first. Can you talk a little bit about that discovery? And then I want to talk about the overlap of the communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're pointing to a gap in how Canadians understand our history. Because what you just said, that you thought your community was the first Black community in this part of the world, I have heard people saying, and it doesn't matter what generation they're from. I still hear young Black people saying that today, or saying, I thought I was the only Black person in Alberta, or I thought my little, my family community or my community of immigrants were the first Black people to come here. No, our history is rich and deep. And as you mentioned, I'm from a community that arrived kind of between 1905, 1912. And yes, I thought we were the first Black people here. And it wasn't until I was an adult, and it was again in part because of John Ware, even though I had learned about John Ware, kind of in adolescence, I had thought mistakenly that he was the only Black person present in his time. So that's not really a community. So I through my research about John Ware, I started uncovering more and more people. The further back I went, the more I realized there were not just isolated individuals, that there were communities of Black people, that there was already a community of Black people in Calgary that was organized and that had formed the Colored People's Protective Association in 1910, which was around the time that my ancestors came. So just peeling back the layers of time made me realize that Black people were here from around the same time as European people started coming here for a variety of reasons, for different reasons. Our history on this continent, for the most part, is a history of people who came here not willingly. My ancestors did not come to this part of the world as immigrants. They came here as enslaved people against their will. So it's a very different kind of history and different reasons for people being here. Nevertheless, it's significant that Black people have been here since the 1800s, and that nobody knows that, and that I didn't know it, and you didn't know it, and young people today still don't know it.
Exactly. I think what you just identified when you talked about the gap that Canada has created, it's sort of an invention of Canadian history and of Canadian society that sees itself predominantly as white, and therefore sees anything that's not white as an anomaly or something that's recent, doesn't really have roots here. And the irony is, and we actually talk about this in your film, the irony is that those of us who are from here, even though we're not white, we absorb those things as well. And so we come to see Canada that way too, and naturally conclude that, oh yeah, I must be the only one. Yeah, which is crazy. Exactly. We must have been the first ones. But as you just pointed out, as long as Europeans have been coming here, Black people have been coming as well. And the fallacy is that there is no history. And thank goodness for your documentary and all your work, because that helps us to see that there is an actual history. Cheryl, I actually want to talk a little bit more about John Ware, but I'm kind of mindful of the time. I'm just wondering, could you quickly outline for us, for people who are not familiar, what was your family connection to the Ware family? So you have connections, you knew them. And so how is that possible exactly? And this is the overlap of the community I want people to hear about.
Okay. Well, I want to make it very clear. I did not know John Ware. He died in 1905. And sadly, I missed an opportunity to really get to know John Ware's children, because they were elders in my community. And people who were in my life, my people who were close to me, my Uncle Andrew and Aunt Edie Risby, knew the Wares well. Uncle Andrew was in fact the person who found Bob Ware when he died. So I met Nettie and Mildred, the two daughters, once, but it just didn't really click in who these very significant people were. I was still pretty young, hadn't really started my research yet, and they were at Uncle Andrew and Aunt Edie's house for an event. They had some time that they had to pass, so they were there, but I didn't take advantage of that at all, because I didn't really know who they were. I knew their names, and I knew the name John Ware, and maybe I even recognized that they were his children, but just wasn't savvy enough at that point to go, oh my goodness, this is living history. But many, many people in my community knew them well. Fran Williams knew them well. Bodie and Viola Bowen knew them well. Uncle Knapp and Aunt Gotchi Sneed knew them well. And these were connections that were made more meaningful for me when I had the opportunity to look at Nettie Ware's archives, which had been preserved by the Mallory family of Kirkcaldy, Alberta. And I saw, yeah. Like, what are these photos of my family doing in Nettie Ware's photo album? And what are the, here's all these people that I knew who were at her birthday party and signed her autograph book. So there was definitely overlap between my community and the Ware family, but unfortunately, I did not take advantage of it when I could have. The Wares, all of the Ware children were alive well into my lifetime.
Wow. Well, as you said, you were young, youthful, and that's something that defines the youth, I think. We just don't really pay that much attention to elderly, the connections to history until we do. And usually it's too late or almost too late at that point. Yeah, it's quite sad. But you have redeemed yourself in many, many ways. So don't worry about that at all. And now you are one of those elders, and you have produced works that people have to see now. They have to encounter, and will inspire them to think about these things and reach out and connect.
That's my hope.
For sure. Definitely. I began by saying I couldn't be a writer without you, right? So definitely. I want to talk a little bit about this character, Grant Mcewen. And the reason why I want to bring him up now is because we have been talking a lot about history and our understandings of history and how your perceptions get shaped by history. And indeed, one of the things that you mentioned was that there have always been communities of Black people, but we didn't always recognize them as a community. So you had heard of John Ware, and you thought, but that's just one person, right? And part of that, I think, has to do with how history is presented and represented to us. And then we absorb some of these things. And Grant Mcewen, particularly those of you on the West Coast may not be familiar with him. Grant Mcewen was a politician. He was actually mayor of Calgary for a while. He went on to become lieutenant governor of the province, but is most notable to us anyway as a historian. And his focus as a historian is on the prairie provinces. And he really has the goal of trying to create a history that common people can engage, like story. And one quote I remember him mentioning is he wants history to be enjoyed like hockey night in Canada is enjoyed. So he had that kind of sensibility. He wanted it to be fun and folksy and that sort of thing. He turns out to be the person to produce what ends up being the definitive biography on John Ware. It's published in 1960, which is over 50 years after John Ware has died. And in that way, it's almost like the Bible, isn't it? Where these people are kind of talking about this central figure long after he has passed away. But this becomes the main way in which people now refer to John Ware and understand John Ware. And I know that you share certain feelings that I do about this text. I'd like to just hear for you, what does Grant Mcewen's book mean to you now that you have done this film and you've done a lot of research on John Ware? And I should point out to the audience that some of the ambivalences that can be felt in Grant Mcewen's text is that it is old, it's published in 1960. He tries very hard to represent John Ware as a folksy hero, but he is also limited by certain stereotypes. Okay? And I'll leave it at that. So what has your relationship to that text? What has it been like going through the project of creating that documentary? Did it change? Just talk about your relationship to that text.
I would say my relationship to the text itself didn't change. The first time I read the book, it was like a bit of a kick in the gut because of the voice that he ascribes to John Ware, which was not a voice that rang true for me. I knew dozens of people from dozens of different American southern states, none of whom talked like that. It was very much like a Hollywood caricature of how a Black person speaks. So exactly. My very first read of the book was really difficult. At the same time, I appreciated what I was learning, what I was able to learn about John Ware's life from the book. Over time, and when I say it didn't change, what did change over time was realizing that the story he told in the first 4 or so chapters of the book about John Ware's life in the South had no grounding in sources that we could discover. And since that time, I have worked hard with several historians to try to verify that information and was never able to do so. We should have been able to identify the 2 white men that Grant Mcewen associates with John Ware's life. And often that's how you have to find Black people, is first through, unfortunately, the white people who call themselves slave owners. So that being unable to verify that information was what caused me in some ways to embark on a search for where did he really come from then, because I understand why Grant Mcewen chose to do that. It's hard to tell a heroic story when you don't know how it begins or where it begins or what happened in the beginning. The text still holds a place in my heart as a document that kept John Ware's memory alive, and I appreciate that. The thing that has changed for me is my relationship to people who want Grant Mcewen's book to continue to be the definitive document about John Ware's life. So probably the most serious critique I have had about the film is in relation to not outright saying, how dare you contradict the information of this great man, but so quite a bit of pushback, just because some people are not able to hold 2 separate ideas in their minds at once. One, that in some ways Grant Mcewen missed the mark, and two, that it was still, important and significant that he wrote about John Ware, and it still matters to people like me and to people like you. We can appreciate that while also recognizing that it missed the mark in many ways, and it's long past time for a person of African descent to tell that story in a way that respects and honors who John Ware might have been, differently from the way that Grant Mcewen felt he was respecting and honoring who John Ware was.
Right, exactly. Very well put. I should have mentioned for our audience who are not familiar with Grant Mcewen, he really is a revered figure here. He really is. And so when someone like Cheryl says, well, I'm not too sure about this book, that will rub some people the wrong way, because it is like, changing their view of this revered person and history and truth. And that can be challenging to some people. I think it would be a great idea if we shared some of this language that you just referred to, Cheryl, with the audience. And here, Candy, if I can ask you to pull up, I believe it is the first quote I have, I believe. And this is the kind of language that Cheryl is referring to, that is reflective of a kind of caricature of Black people from the South. And this is how white people think of them. I even hesitate to read it out loud because it's so galling. It's so difficult. But you can see in there the golly me's and the never this and that sort of thing. I also want to point out that, and I wanted to show you this quote, folks, because there are many times in which you read this text in which you actually have a difficulty understanding what is he trying to say here? What exactly is he trying to say? So if you see in the third line, I show don't like it when my cow's happy. The first time I read that, I thought, what's that? Oh, right. So as you can see here, and I don't want to dwell on this, this is a kind of invented kind of lingo that Grant Mcewen has come up with. And frankly, it's offensive. There's nothing, we can't get around that. There's no other way of putting it. It's offensive. At the same time, though, Grant Mcewen has produced a text that has delved much more deeply into John Ware's life than anyone else did before him, certainly. And it does hold a special place for me. And he is trying to demonstrate John Ware as a kind of hero, a kind of folksy hero. I would like us to skip to the next slide, please, Candy. We'll see an example of how Grant Mcewen is, trying to counter something. Okay, and so I'm going to read this, and I want to get your response to this, Cheryl, and what this makes you feel like when you read this in Grant Mcewen's text. Good people, Mcewen says, with no intention of being unjust or unkind, simply didn't expect a Negro cattleman to be superior in anything. They joke with John and enjoy him, but it didn't occur to them to invite his opinions in matters of importance. Ultimately, their opinion changed. His grammar was faulty and his enunciation a little unusual, but his way of analyzing the problems of the frontier was practical, and people were recognizing this. What do you think about that text? What does that bring to mind when you see that?
Yeah, so there's some truth in that. In that John Ware's just putting his head down and getting the job done did win him a lot of friends. Lots of people who were not good people and did intend to be unkind were swirling around John Ware and in his life, and were refusing to acknowledge that a Black man could be all that he was, that could be a leader, that could be the boss, on the ranch and that kind of thing. So I think the text tries to say that no one intended any harm toward John Ware ever, and that eventually he won everybody over, and it was all friends all around. And that is so there's sort of some half truth in that quote.
Yes, I would agree with you. It's a complex quote in the text, and it's got levels of all kinds of things happening in there. If we had a 3-hour talk, we could stay there and talk more about it. I actually want to move to the next. It is definitely white fragility. Actually, I agree with that. Yeah, I want to move to the next one, because here's a sentiment that I feel that you have brought to the fore in your story of John Ware. And here is a story of love that Grant Mcewen is trying to convey anyway. So John and Mildred are married in the early 1890s and move off to near Sheep Creek, I think is the first place where they lived after Calgary. They were married in Calgary. And they move off there. And this is Grant Mcewen's send-off. The newlyweds bought some groceries, dishes, bed sheets, and towels at the Big Stone Store and drove away over winter roads and into a new world of romance, with more happiness in their hearts than either had ever known. All right, peachy keen, lovely. This is a story that we don't hear very much with John Ware. And I feel as though you have made it a central story in your telling, at least a part of your telling of John Ware. Why was it important for you to include the relationship between John and Mildred in your telling?
Well, I'm glad you included that quote. First of all, because it shows Grant Mcewen in a better light. And I wholeheartedly agree that their love was a place of happiness that neither of them had known or perhaps had ever even expected that they would know, especially John Ware. He may not have ever expected to meet someone like Mildred that he loved so dearly. I guess it was important to me to include that story in my film and in my play as well, because Black people have traditionally had a way of closing the door on the outside world and creating the most beautiful spaces in our homes. I felt that when I was a child, when I would be in the embrace of my community for a big gathering or a small gathering, there was just so much love that happened in the homes, and there was a safety there that does not get recognized or represented very often, especially I would say in Black Canadian life. We do have some examples in American films and books of Black family life and love stories between Black people, but we don't really get to see that about Black Canada. And I believe that John and Mildred created that same place of safety and beauty and love and warmth and shut the door on everything else. And I wanted to represent that in my film and in my play.
Absolutely wonderful. So clearly there are elements to Black lives that have just been left out of the histories. But there are also elements to our lived experiences that are significant to us and now need to be shared. One of the things that this makes me think of is the limited space that seems to be made available for Blackness in the wider society. So, for example, we've heard of cowboys, but we haven't really heard of Black cowboys. Oh, if we heard of Black cowboys, now we've heard of John Ware, but nobody else, right? I'm curious, do you have any thoughts about why it is that we have John Ware as our figurative cowboy, but we've not really heard of any of the other Black cowboys that also were working the range at this period?
Oh, this is a question, honestly, that I could probably spend a half hour trying to
Well, you have 2
answer.
minutes.
Exactly. Thanks, Bertrand. Often there's been a singular figure that has been pulled out to represent all of Blackness for a variety of reasons. I won't say for some reason as though I don't have any thoughts on what those reasons might be, but for a variety of reasons. As you mentioned earlier, we've had this story in Canada that there were Indigenous people here and then white people came. We haven't had the story of other groups of people that came. We haven't had the stories of our relationships to those other groups of people. We haven't had the Black and Indigenous relationship stories, which are very rich and very deep. We haven't had the stories about Black people, about my community in the 1910s and 20s, and our relationships to the Chinese community, to the Sikh community. We just don't have those stories. And often one person is pulled out to represent each group individually. And if you included everybody, it would contradict the story of this as a space of whiteness. So I think that's why I think John Ware was a very memorable person. It's makes sense that he was the one that was pulled out to be remembered. He made an incredible impression on people. He was probably the most successful of the Black Cowboys and ranchers that were around, at least as far as we know. But we may just not know how, for example, Jim Whitford was regarded, or Billy Welsh, or Green Walters. I know he's a figure that you're interested in. So we remember John Ware because he was memorable, and because he seemed to walk alongside safely the narrative that Canada was a place that was not anti-Black, because how could it have been? Because John Ware was here and he succeeded. He sort of has been pulled out to represent all of Blackness in his time, and also to represent that sort of mythology that we have around who we are as Canadians. So again, sorry that I don't have more time to spend on this, because it's a huge question.
It is, and you have to forgive me for asking it, but it's a legitimate question. I want to very quickly remind everyone that you're free to throw things into the chat if you have any questions. We do have some time afterwards to address those. But right now, I want to address that gap that we've just talked about. So we all know about John Ware, but there are others. So let's talk a little bit about some of the others in the remaining few minutes. Is there anyone that you want to focus on specifically that we can draw out? Because we don't really have a lot of time, sorry.
Pete Smith is someone that I would love to know more about. He was a Black cowboy who was in BC for a time, and he was in Alberta, and he was a cook. That was a very important role on the wide open range and in the roundups. But he was also a very good friend of John Ware. So I would love to know more about him. He was staying with John Ware at the time that John died. John was very lonely. Mildred had died 6 months previous. Most of the kids were away at school with their grandparents in Blairmore. But John was so lonely that he had brought Bob Ware back home, the oldest boy, and he had Pete Smith. Excuse me. I've had this cough. We're lucky I haven't visited it upon you yet.
I know, I have some water here, but I can't even give it to you. I'm sorry.
I have some too.
All right.
Pete Smith is someone that there are so many. I would love to talk about some of the women of the frontier as well. You and I have talked about that a few times.
Yes, definitely.
Florida Wolf was the common law partner of another rancher and they had a ranch close to the Ware's place over on the Red Deer River, so closer over to Brooks. Their time overlapped, 1900 to 1902 was approximately when they were there. John and Mildred were there until they died in 1905. So they would have been neighbors. Flora Wolf was credited with pulling together the financial life and the business world of de Laval Beresford, who was the man who owned the ranch. You know, he was, some people call him Lord Beresford. He was from a wealthy Irish family and did a lot of ranching in Mexico, in the southern US, and in Alberta. But she was amazing. I'm going to see if I can quickly share my screen. I have
Oh yeah, great.
I think I have a photo of her.
Here we go, folks. Florida Wolf.
Come on, open up.
No, this is feeling very much like one of my classes right now.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, it's looking like I'm not going to be able to bring that up.
Oh, that's too bad. That is too bad. Yeah.
But, you know, a really amazing woman. And there were many others.
Yeah.
What about you?
Great.
What about you? Who are you most interested in as you embark on this book of poetry?
Yeah, I have a lot of people. Like you said, there are too many people out there. As you've already mentioned, Green Walters is a long-standing preoccupation of mine. I'm very interested in him. I feel as though he can help to unlock a kind of historical key because unlike John Ware and some of the others, in fact, Green Walters was not a cowboy's cowboy. John Ware has always been a cowboy, and it's very clear he comes from that background, whatever his background is exactly. Green Walters is one of these men, one of these African-American men who does a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And I should probably remind our audience that we're talking about the very beginning of the 20th century, the very end of the 19th century. And so we're barely a generation away from the end of slavery in the United States. And so you have a generation of people who are now emerging from their enslavement, trying to find their way in life, trying to work their way. And of course, racism still exists. And so they can't just get hired in jobs that they want to. They can't just go to Harvard and get educated as they might want to. And so they try to find things. And as you even pointed out in our interview earlier with Doria Makarenko, that there is a kind of fluidity, a kind of constant movement that takes place, even across borders with these people. They're just constantly searching for some sort of security, some way in the world. And he strikes me as one of these people emblematically. He was known as a cook, but also he was a hay contractor. Also, he was a laborer, like many of them were. Also, he was a cowboy, worked with John Ware briefly as well. And I feel that if I could just find something about his early origins, that it would unlock something. My guess is, and this is purely a guess, it's a hunch, that he actually fought in the Civil War. This is my guess. And he might have been a Buffalo Soldier or one of these people who fought for their freedom and learned certain tricks of the trade and learned how to do certain things from that. And that helped him to be a survivor. It's just a hunch, but I would like to follow that up. He's my number one that I would really like to figure out. As you pointed out earlier, though, it's so hard to find information on these people because a lot of information was simply not retained for them. I also am very interested in women as well. And I will just quickly point to one woman I'm very interested in, who is the wife of a black cowboy in Montana. These are our borders shifting again. There was a lot of movement, of course, between Montana and Alberta, and cattle trails went right through there, in fact. But there is a black cowboy by the name of Joseph Proctor, who I learned of through Dom Lemon's Black Cowboys. Dom Lemon's a musician. Those of you might be familiar with him. He's a musician who practices, he plays kind of country blues, and he has that a style that is a tribute to the African-American contribution to what we think of as country music today. So he has a song that is basically a telling of a poem by this cowboy poet, Wally McCrae, describes fantastic description of Joseph Proctor. I want you folks to go out and read it yourself because it's so brilliantly done. It's called Old Proc is what it's called. Go and find it. It's an amazing poem. But when I discovered him, I learned that he had married this Lizzie McHarg, who was half his age. She was 21 when she married him, and that they moved and settled on a ranch in Montana. It's in Rosebud County today is what it's called anyway. It's in ranch territory of Montana. And they started a fairly modest ranch there. And she was responsible for the books. This to me feels like a very strong consistency that we see a lot of the time. The women are involved in the bookkeeping and, maybe had a level of literacy that the men didn't have, maybe. But at the same time, I want us to always remember, and this happens today even with farm wives, as they are sometimes known as, women may have done the books, but they also did the cow herding. They also did the cattling. They also did all of the stuff that we associate with cowboys and farmers as well. And so I'm intrigued to find what her contributions may have been as well. So that's mine anyway. Yeah.
What an
Lizzie
incredible
McHarg.
story. Yeah.
I know. Amazing, right? Amazing.
I'm going to do more research. Thank you, Karen, for posting that Wikipedia article about Florida Wolf there. And I think it has a photo of her. I saw someone earlier that had asked for us to share more about Black Cowboys and Indigenous people. And, maybe that's a good opportunity to talk about Dave Mills and his father, Henry Mills, who were here both before John Ware's time. Right. Henry Mills married a woman from the Blood tribe. And so Dave Mills was their son. And Dave Mills also married into that community. His wife's name was Naduatastaki, was her Blackfoot name, and it translated to Holy Rabbit Woman. And there are still many descendants of the Mills family on the reserve and in southern Alberta. The relationships between Black and Indigenous people are so entwined that I often don't even know where to begin when people ask me about our relationship, because they're just connections between Black and Indigenous people in this part of the world are everywhere and are very deep. And there's just so many people in my own community, for example, the community of descendants of the Black migration of 1910, who are Black and Indigenous, that, it's really hard to know where to start. But there were many, many marriages between Black and Indigenous people. That goes back even to your research, Bertrand, about the trappers up in northern Alberta in the 1700s. That relationship was very strong then too.
Exactly. I think it bears reminding that whenever different peoples encounter each other, always mixtures take place, always, regardless of the stories that we inherit, that always mixtures take place. I think the blurring of boundaries is very nicely demonstrated by that sort of thing. And your brief foray into Dave Mills just now is also a reminder of how that Montana-Alberta boundary really didn't exist for people back then in the same way that we think of it today. And that the Kainai, the Blood tribe, they didn't recognize that boundary at all, the 49th parallel. And so for them, it was just all one boundary. And Henry Mills lived on both sides of those, with the Blood on the American side and on the Canadian side. The Indigenous Black relationship is very deep and is historically goes back very far. Exactly. You wouldn't even know where to start. Everywhere you look, you will see it, essentially. Absolutely. All right. You know what, Cheryl? We are coming to near the end of our time. And so I want to very quickly ask you about things that you are working on. And we'll see about questions. I wonder if I'm not actually seeing the questions in the chat here. I just want to make sure my settings are working properly here. Right. Okay. So I see that John Ware Imagined is which is the play that you wrote. I see that is getting a production outside of Alberta. So the Blyth Festival, I think. Did I read that? Yes,
Yep.
that's right. That's fantastic. And also, I see that Heaven is being produced again. This is an older play of Cheryl's. I have virtual tickets for it through the Citadel Theatre this year, but also it is playing in Calgary later this year at Lunchbox Theatre. So that's fantastic. That's going on. What else is happening? Is there anything else going on with you that you want to share with us?
Yeah. Well, I know you're a big fan of Miranda, my daughter, the
Yes.
singer-songwriter who's in my film. Miranda and I are working on a young adult book together and just having so much fun. And she's so motivating for me. Yeah, that I'm really excited about that. Then I'm working on a book about Calgary's Black history as well. I see there is a question here from Omaira asking, why is it important to engage with Black prairie history in this moment in Canada? Because, well, it's always been important, but I think we are in a time where people are recognizing that there are a lot of gaps. There are a lot of missing stories. There are a lot of things that people from communities have been trying to tell all of us, and we haven't been listening. You know, when we think about all the stories that are being uncovered on former residential so-called schools, I think it is a time when people are aware that there are gaps in our knowledge, and it is impossible to think about moving forward into a positive future if we don't first reconcile with our past and recognize it. And the past, the present, and the future are all linked. I don't have to tell anyone that. It's a cliche to say it. And I think it's important because we want survival. We want a future. You know, we want a better future. And it's really critical that we acknowledge our past in order to try to build that.
Great question, Omaira. Yeah, and I could there's nothing more I could add to that, but I would simply point out that the time does seem right now anyway for certain people to be listening. There have been people working at this for many years. Cheryl is one of these people who has been writing, and in fact, Cheryl's done everything, folks. If you don't know this, she's written in every single genre. She's a filmmaker. She's done everything, all right? Historian, researcher, et cetera, et cetera. Been doing this sort of work for years, for decades, and it has never really taken. But now I think, let me actually change that. I want to revise that. It is never really taken by white people, by and large, because it has always galvanized people of color and Black people specifically to discover these things. Cheryl had mentioned earlier in our conversation when we were talking about the loving relationship between John and Mildred, how once you close the door and get into your shelter, it's an entirely different world, a nurturing, loving world that she herself experienced. And I too experienced something like that too, growing up with my African immigrant parents. I often say that, you know, I walked around in a white Canadian world, but when I went home, it was almost like being in Sierra Leone again, almost. So there is a kind of a desire that we have because we've been shut out of the major dominant stories. And so when we hear about these things, we latch onto it. We become our own educators. But what I'm trying to say is it seems as though we are reaching perhaps a time in which it's not only us who are paying attention to these stories. And therefore, we should take advantage. We should strike while the iron is hot, essentially, because I'm going to be frank with you, who knows how long these ears are going to listen. I know that Cheryl is going to keep on doing what she does, and I will keep on doing what I do. But in terms of the impact that it can have and the wider community, all we can do is do what we do. The rest is really up to those who hear, really. All right, I didn't mean to get on my soapbox there. I'm sorry about that. I was actually happier with your response than mine, to be honest. All right, so we have reached 8 o'clock Pacific time and my bedtime, Mountain Standard Time. There might be time for a little bit more, a few more questions if anyone's got them. I've just realized now how I can access through my iPad the chat and the questions. Very good.
And the Q&A. So there was a question about how to find more information. And good, thank you, Andrew, for posting the link to Karina's book.
Exactly. Here's one resource for you can think about here. Okay, I had it next to me just in case I want to quote from it. This is Cheryl's book here, Pourin Down Rain, classic. And then here's Karina's, oh, sorry, take that off. Here's Karina's book right here, The Black Prairie Archives, another classic. Well, and it's a new classic, this one. Both excellent resources for engaging history, Black histories, Black prairies. What am I trying to say? Black history on the prairie.
Well, and your book of poetry as well, Bertrand, is a very important resource. Do you have it there? Because it's just a different way of, oh, I have mine upstairs. I should have brought it down with me. Different way of engaging with the history. A question about how I found that storytelling culture in your own community growing up, the history and chronicling a task being taken up by women. I come from a storytelling culture. African descended peoples are storytelling peoples. And so I would say both the men and women of my family and of my community were fantastic storytellers. And I was surrounded by brilliant people who knew how to act, knew how to enunciate, knew how to project. They were beautiful storytellers, and I feel that I've come by my love of story and of sharing story very honestly.
I would agree with that.
Your book has been posted in the chat.
Oh,
Good.
That's great. Thank you
Good.
for doing that. That's great. Yeah, I would agree with you. I learned about Alberta's Black history through your family story, and as well, there is the that anthology, what's it called again? A Window of Our Memory. And there's mention again of your family in there as well, and the storytelling women in there as well. And I learned a lot from your storytelling women too. You and your, is it your Aunt Drusilla? Now I've forgotten all of a sudden.
Aunt Daisy.
Daisy, how could I forget that? Daisy Smith, right, yeah. But in my family, it has also been the women, I have to say. And definitely there are men who are telling stories and they're story keepers as well. But I experienced primarily my family stories and the histories through women. And I would have to say my mom is the biggest historian of our family. And indeed, I learned of a lot of Black history in Alberta through her. She is the one who first turned me on to your book. And that opened up all sorts of things for me. She also helped to connect me to the connection between Sierra Leone and Canada and that history as well, which we don't have time to get into now. And it's got nothing to do with cowboys anyway, so we won't talk about it. But it's just another history that's buried that forms a part of Canadian history that most of us don't know about. So for me, the women are the storytellers, the story keepers, and the historians. And I always try to do justice to them because of that.
Thank you for mentioning Aunt Daisy specifically. She is, without her storytelling, there's no me storytelling.
Right.
Yeah.
There you go. Right. Cheryl, it turns out you're a better moderator than I am at this, because I can't find these questions. Here we go. Here's a question. Is it one? No, it's not. I think someone is asking about the timing of your film. Oh, and the harder they fall. Right. Okay. So I think this is a comment. I'm not sure, but I didn't actually watch this movie, The Harder They Fall. I think it's on Netflix. At least it was. And this is a film that features Black Cowboys, essentially. So most of the big names of African-American cowboys feature in this film. Bass Reeves is there, I think. Mary Fields, who we didn't have a chance to talk about, she's in this. And Nat Love, these are big names from the African-American cowboy or frontier history. And I think that what Peggy is getting at here is that there's actually really good synergy going on with the work that you're putting out and then the work that's taking place in popular culture as well. Did you watch The Harder They Fall? Are you aware of this? Because I missed it entirely.
No, I haven't watched it yet. I'm assuming we can still see it.
Yeah, I hope so. These things come and go, on Netflix.
Yeah. I actually just heard about it a couple of weeks ago.
Right. Yeah. I heard about it, but typical to me, I heard about it and then got busy and can't do anything until June. So that's when I'll watch it. I think that popular culture is now latching on to Blackness and is centering Blackness. I don't know for how long they will do it, and I don't know how effectively they will continue to do it. But I mentioned earlier Don Fleming's CD, which is available in Spotify. Didn't mean for this to sound like an advertisement. It's called Black Cowboys, and you can look him up. Don Fleming came to Calgary. He was touring. He came to Calgary before the pandemic, and I missed it. I was so busy. I kicked myself for that. What's that other band called? Oh, I just forgot their names. Chocolate Drops or Chocolate... I forget what they're called. But it's another band that he's featured in that also features this kind of music as well. They're from the South, and they're bringing back Carolina Chocolate Drops. Thank you. That's it. Thank you. And they're helping to make that connection between Blackness and country music that has been ignored for the longest time.
I saw Don Fleming's show, and I spent a fantastic afternoon with him, just walking around, showing him the John Ware exhibit at the Glenbow. I have a photo of him standing in front of the picture of John Ware. And my favorite song from that album is Steel Pony Blues. It's fantastic.
Oh, right. Fantastic. Right. Cheryl, I didn't know that. I didn't know you spent the day with him. I'm so jealous.
I know. I didn't want to make you jealous, so I didn't mention it before.
Well, you just did.
Sorry.
That's wonderful. All right. That's a story time. I want to hear about that another time for sure. Okay. Andrew is now linking something up there. So you guys check it out. I'm sorry. My iPad is stupid. So it just flashes it up and then it disappears. Folks, I feel like I could keep on talking and talking and talking. I feel like now it's 10 after 9. Maybe I need to draw things to a close now is kind of what I'm feeling like. It has been wonderful talking with you, Cheryl. I always love talking with you. I'm so happy to hear about the works that you are now working on. And I'm so glad that you're seeing this ongoing success with John Ware Reclaimed and renewed interest in some of your earlier works as well. I wish nothing but the best and more success for you in that regard. And it's been an entire pleasure and an honor to spend this time with you. Thank you very much, Cheryl.
Thank you, Bertrand. From the bottom of my heart. It's just, I'm so blessed to have you in my life. And we are so blessed in this community to have you as a poet and a historian and a person willing to engage in these kinds of conversations. Thank you, Candy. Thank you, Andrew, Vancouver Public Library, and everybody who came and stayed long past what is our bedtime here in Alberta.
Thank you so much, Cheryl and Bertrand. We really appreciate it. We know it's getting to your bedtime, so thank you for taking that extra time out with us today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us online. Again, huge thank yous to Cheryl and Bertrand. Thank you to my colleague Andrew for keeping the event running smoothly in the background and sharing all those links that you did. Thank you, Ross, for being here from the National Film Board. We would love to receive feedback about this event. As a public institution, we are here for you. So we're going to share a link to the feedback form in the chat, which will take you just about a minute to fill out. I did want to mention a couple of events that we have coming up soon. On Tuesday, April 26th at 12 p.m., we have an event called Unearthing the Past, Japanese-Canadian Artists on the Legacy of the Internment, where contemporary Japanese artists will share personal histories of their art, visual storytelling, and performance. And Andrew will share a link for that one. And then on Thursday, May 26th at 7 p.m., we're going to have an event around K-pop and activism with the K-pop professor, Dr. Cedarbow Seiji, and a local superfan named Emily Wang and writer Stefan Lee, who's an author of 2 K-pop books. The event will be posted to our website and social media soon, so stay tuned for that one. If you want to watch this event again, we will also have it available on our YouTube page. So we're going to share a link for that. So I want to thank you again to everyone to coming out and supporting the event tonight. We're going to leave the chat window open for a couple more minutes. You can, paste any of those links or open up any of those links to a new window and have a look at them. So thank you again for coming out tonight, and we hope to see you again soon. Have a great evening, everyone.